So you got some sourdough starter and now you have no idea what to do with it. How do you go from this bubbly thing in a jar to a loaf of bread? How do you keep it alive and use it for baking? My name is Rachel, and in today's video, I'm going to share the basics of how to keep your sourdough starter alive, happy and healthy, and ready for baking. Let's get started. I have had my sourdough starter for about 4 years. I really enjoy learning more about it, sharing about it, and being able to bake all of the wonderful things that you see on my channel. But before we get into the maintenance of a sourdough starter, there are a couple of terms that we should define first to make this conversation more understandable. The first is feeding your sourdough starter. What does it mean to feed your sourdough starter? Well, first of all, you should know your sourdough starter is alive. The yeast and bacteria in here are what make it bubbly. This is flour and water, and then it has cultivated those yeast and bacteria to live inside of it. Those living yeast and bacteria need to eat. They need to eat flour and water. So when you feed your sourdough starter, you dump in flour, you dump in water, and you mix it together. Equal parts of both. It doesn't matter how much, just roughly equal parts. And those yeast and bacteria will feed on that, create gases, and those are the bubbles that you see in the side here. And that is what will leaven your baked goods. The gases will make your bread dough rise. Whenever there's not enough food, whenever they've eaten through it, your sourdough starter will deflate. All those bubbles will be gone, you will see the level drop, and that's how you know it's hungry and ready for more. Some other important terms related to this topic include active starter and sourdough discard. Active starter is when it's at its peak rise. So when it's very bubbly and has reached the top of its rise, that is when it is most active. Sourdough discard is when it has deflated and there are not as many active bubbles. So those recipes do not need the full strength of the yeast and bacteria to rise items. They can just be flat and provide the sourdough flavor. A couple of these include like sourdough crackers. You don't need those to rise. You use sourdough discard, so you can just roll out those crackers, bake them, and they just taste really good. Now that you understand a couple of those concepts, there are two main ways to keep your sourdough starter alive. First of all is keeping it on the countertop. Second is keeping it in the fridge. Most people choose the fridge option, so I'm going to quickly go over the countertop option, knowing that probably won't be your preference. But if you choose to keep your sourdough starter on the countertop, you will keep it in your glass jar. Lots of people like to use mason jars. Keep it on the countertop. You feed it your equal parts flour and water. Stir it in. Also, to note, when you keep it on the counter, you want a lid on it that's loose. You need that airflow so it can ferment, but you don't want it covered completely. So you leave that on the countertop and it will get very bubbly and deflate. If you leave it on the countertop, you need to feed it about every day and you need to use it about every day. This is why most people don't keep it on the countertop. I guess professional bakeries or people who do this every day would keep it on the countertop, but I don't know many moms at home who use their sourdough starter every day like this. So that's your first option, but knowing you probably won't do that, here's the second option, which is it lives in the fridge. This is how my sourdough starter works. I have my jar, I put a lid on tightly this time and stick it in the fridge. Your starter will still ferment, but it will ferment much more slowly. That's how the fridge works, right? It slows down any of that bacterial processing. So you just need to pull it out and feed it at least once a week. That's it, pretty easy. Most people, I recommend starting with pancakes. So you get your starter, you bring it home, you put it in the fridge. Then most people do pancakes on Saturday mornings, so I'm going to use that as an example. You pull your starter out on Friday evening and you feed it a bunch of flour and a bunch of water, equal parts, however much you want to add. Although this is an important note, the more starter you have, the more you need to feed it because there are more yeast and bacteria who need more food. Feed it a bunch of flour, a bunch of water, lightly cover it and let it sit on your countertop overnight. That will bring it to room temperature, that will make it very bubbly, and by Saturday morning you will have a nice bubbly sourdough starter. The pancake recipe that I often use is from Lisa at Farmhouse on Boone. And for her pancake recipe, you just pull straight starter out of the jar. So you'll have that bubbly, active starter in the morning ready for your pancakes. As another example, the bagel recipe that I make, you make the dough in the evening and let the dough ferment overnight before shaping it in the morning. So in one of these instances, I remove my sourdough starter from the fridge around lunchtime the day of. So I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge for convenience, but it needs to come up to room temperature and it needs to be bubbly by the time I make my dough. So around lunchtime, I will pull my starter out of the fridge. I will feed it equal parts flour and water. The amount depends on how much starter you need and how much starter you already have. So you can play around with that. Equal parts flour and water, and then I cover it loosely and let it sit on my countertop. It comes to room temperature, it starts growing and getting bubbly, and by the time evening comes, it is ready for me to make my dough. I'll make my bagel dough in the evening and let that bagel dough sit overnight before I'm ready to make bagels in the morning. As you get accustomed to sourdough starters, you will learn how to get it out ahead of time, how to feed it, and how to watch it grow. Some of the other things that really affect sourdough are the temperature and humidity. So I know that in the summertime, my sourdough starter rises about twice as quickly as it does in the wintertime. I also know that it is affected by the heat being on in my house, or just like the cool fall temperatures, or the humidity and heat of the summer versus the dry heat of the winter. And these are things that you just learn with time and practice. The best way you can learn about a sourdough starter, making sourdough bread, all of these things, is to be really observant, to remember what you do with it, to watch how it interacts with the flour, the water, the temperature, the humidity, how much you need it, how much you work with it. All of these things come with practice. So I know this feels really intimidating, but just remember, take it out of the fridge once a week. Start with pancakes. Those are very simple. Get it out ahead of time and feed it. Let it get bubbly and use it, and then stick it back in the fridge until next time. The most important thing to remember is that sourdough starters are extremely resilient, extremely resilient. It's very difficult to kill a sourdough starter. So please do not give up on your sourdough. Just keep it in your fridge until you're ready to use it. If anything, just put a little flour and water in there once a week, even if you're not ready to use it. I know of someone who her sourdough starter lived in her fridge all summer, all 3 or 4 months. She didn't have time for it. She brought it back out and was able to revive it in about a week, and now she can bake bread with it. So don't give up. Keep trying. Please leave me any questions that you have, and I will do my best to answer them. I know I want this to be clear, but again, I've been doing it for a long time, so it's a little bit difficult to explain. I hope this was helpful and that you can start baking with your sourdough really soon.